Hi, this is Sean Perrin, and you're listening to episode 16 of the Clarineat Podcast. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is redefining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with technology built from the ground up. By using the world's most innovative techniques to deliver consistently what was once made variable by hand, D'Addario ensures excellence right out of the box as standard, not a surprise. So you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds. On episode 11 of the podcast, I discussed the Reform Boehm Clarinet System with guest Raisa Fallman. It might come as a surprise, but I really didn't know if that episode would go anywhere because it seems like such an obscure topic, but it actually became the most commented on and shared episode yet. So to continue the conversation, today the guest is Sue Ryall, who is an accomplished performer and educator currently living in Germany. She has recently applied to do her doctorate on the Reform Boehm System and maintains that it represents the most significant developments in clarinet technology since Müller invented the rings and thumb rest. The giveaway for today's episode is a D'Addario prize pack featuring one box of classic or reserve reeds, a reed guard, and some mouthpiece patches. If you'd like to be eligible to win this and other items mentioned on the podcast, please be sure to subscribe to the email newsletter. See Clarineat.com for details. And now for today's episode with Sue Ryall. Welcome to the Clarineat Podcast, Sue, and thanks for taking the time to be with us today on the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So you're currently pursuing the idea of a doctorate studying the Reform Boehm Clarinet System in comparison to the French system, the Boehm system, and the German system, the Müller system.
That's right.
What makes you so passionate about these key systems, and how did you first encounter the Reform Boehm specifically?
Well, I was first introduced to the Reform Boehm clarinet during a lesson with my professor in Hamburg in about 2008 or 2009. A young student of his, or an ex-student, came into my lesson to clarify something, and she had her Reform Boehm clarinet with her. So my professor made me try it and said it was wonderful, and I loved it. I was immediately converted. I felt that the sound it produced was much fuller and much rounder than my R13s. It was just a much more beautiful sound, much more warmth. The instrument as a whole was significantly more in tune than my R13s, and technically the instrument was unquestionably superior. Passages that I'd been struggling with, Stravinsky, Rossini, or Crusel, things that I'd thought I would never ever master, just flowed out effortlessly and brilliantly, and I also felt I had a much wider palette of interpretation and range and color at my fingertips.
So there's many manufacturers that are making these. It must be like, for here, what the Boehm system is. I mean, it's we have dozens probably of manufacturers building great instruments these days. How many would you say are building for Reform Boehm?
Well, there's Leitner and Krauss, there's Wurlitzer, there's Jung, Dietz, and Schwenkensegelke.
And do they all have like a German bore type system?
Well, the Reform Boehm is a clarinet with a German bore. There are various other hybrids which have improved keywork without the German bore, but the ones that are called a Reform Boehm clarinet do have the slightly wider German bore, 14.8 or 14.9 millimeter bore.
Interesting. So some French systems have even tried the keywork improvements too, eh?
Yes. Yeah. There's the Yamaha.
I think it's called the CSG or something.
That's right. Yes.
Is it the CSG?
Yeah. So there's the Yamaha CSG, which has the German bore but the standard Reform Boehm keywork.
So it's so interesting. What's the history of this Reform Boehm system, and who invented it, where, and why?
Well, it has a much longer history than people think. The first one was made by a clarinetist called Ernst Schmidt. Now, he lived in Leipzig. He was born in 1870, died in 1954. And he was very interested in acoustics and had already made the very unusual switch for a German player from Oehler to Boehm, rather like Dirk Altmann in the Stuttgart Orchestra today. He preferred the Boehm key work, but he didn't really like the intonation problems that came with it. So he took the instrument, redesigned the bore, and also recalculated the dimensions and positions of the tone holes. From about 1902 to 1930-31, Schmidt collaborated with a German clarinet maker called Louis Kolbe, who was almost an exact contemporary. He died in 1952. And together they patented the Schmidt-Kolbe clarinet in 1905, which they then followed with a slightly adapted version, or a slightly improved version in 1912, when they added the two-hole speaker key for the throat B flat. Mm-hmm. Schmidt later collaborated with Fritz Wurlitzer, who is the grandfather of today's Ulrich Wurlitzer, and also with the physicist Friedrich Rösch, with whom he redesigned the mouthpiece. They tested these instruments predominantly in orchestras in the Netherlands, which is possibly why they're still quite popular in the Netherlands today, more so than in other places in the world. Schmidt retired in 1935, and Wurlitzer took over the full production of the Reform Boehm clarinet, and he renamed the Schmidt Reform Boehm clarinet in 1956 and called it the Wurlitzer Reform Boehm.
Yes, because I think that many people would regard sort of the 50s, 60s as the birth of these instruments, but it's interesting they come from quite a bit before then. They
were, yes, they're sort of prototypes, and they were still being tested and developed. Interesting, however, is that after the 1950s, a lot of people, a lot of these names I mentioned before, the Jung and the Dietz and Leitner and Krauss, they all used to work at Wurlitzer. And that's where I wouldn't go as far as to say learnt their trade. I don't have the authority to say that, but they certainly would have experienced the Reform Boehms there. And I know from owning my own Leitner and Krauss instruments that the two chappies there, Herr Leitner and Herr Krauss, they left Wurlitzer in 1993 to set up on their own. And yeah, that's what they do. They don't just make the Reform Boehms, they make standard Boehms, they make not Wurlitzer, they make standard Boehms, they make Reform Boehms, and they make the standard Oehler clarinets.
Interesting. So doing all three.
They do all three. And they do bass clarinets as well. And that's the interesting thing about these German makers. They're not factories. They specialize in one thing, a clarinet, maybe two different clarinets or maybe three different clarinets, but that's what they do. And their instruments are handmade from start to finish by the same person.
The same person does all the steps, eh?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes, and you can go along after you've bought it and see the person who made it for you, and say, well, I'd like this, I'm not happy with that, I wouldn't be interested in changing X, Y, Z. And, you have a much closer relationship and a much longer history with your instrument than from the day you buy it from the shop. From the 1950s onwards, after Wurlitzer had taken over the production, various makers left Wurlitzer and set up on their own. So you now get Reform Boehm instruments as well as standard Boehm instruments and Oehler instruments made by people like Jung, Dietz, Leitner and Krauss, Schwenken-Segelke, as well as the Wurlitzer instruments.
Why do you think that they really took off in some parts of the world? Like you mentioned the Netherlands.
That's right, yes. I think the Netherlands was the seat of that's where all these instruments were initially tested in the early days. And I think that's where the popularity really began to grow. That's sort of filtered down a little bit into Germany, although in Germany you have a very strong German tradition to contend with.
Yeah, because it would seem that might be just sort of like a proximity thing. I mean, they were invented there, and people, that's where they use them. And here, I'd never seen one until I saw races the other day. That was really the first time.
I think what's also important is that there's a wonderfully vibrant European community of clarinetists, which is linked online via things like Facebook, and I think that's where people go to meet other clarinetists. You can discover new instruments, find new techniques, and basically this exchange, and that's seated very very firmly in Europe. And from there, it will spread out and go to other places further afield, like Canada, like the States, like Japan. I'm not sure if there's any in South Africa or in Russia. But what you've also got to contend with within that, of course, is the home culture of the country you're visiting. In Germany, for example, the Reform Boehm is growing in popularity, I think, because it offers you a much wider range of opportunities in terms of the sound color that you can produce. But what you also have to bargain into that is the fact that your home culture has got a very strong influence on what's happening. I mean, if you take, for instance, the example of vibrato in Holland and the tradition of vibrato in Germany, the two are completely different. No vibrato at all in the German tradition. In the last 20 or 30 years, that's slowly beginning to change. But the old school still maintains vibrato does not belong in the German clarinet sound.
Do you know any of the history around that? Because that always has fascinated me. I mean, saxophone, flute, oboe, all these instruments, they just love to use vibrato. And I know there's some, sort of reasoning for clarinet as far as the overtone series or something not being at the octave, or I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
Because vibrato in Germany is a big no-no. Traditionally speaking, although I think that's possibly changing. In fact, I know for a fact that that's changing. Whereas in Holland, of course, vibrato has been part of the Dutch clarinet sound for many, many years. And I think that's partly because Holland is a little bit more descriptive in its approach, rather like Britain. There seems to be a much greater degree of freedom in what you do and that sort of wait and see what develops approach. Whereas in Germany, they're slightly more prescriptive in that they have this very, very particular ideal of what they're looking for, and they want you to produce that ideal, and that ideal includes no vibrato. So that's one possible reason. Another factor is also, I believe anyway, is that of role models. I think it's crucial. It's very important. Crucial who you encounter as a young player and how they influence you. It might be your teacher, it might be a performer or a clarinetist you have heard play. I was talking recently to Matthias Schorn. He plays with the Vienna Philharmonic, and he plays the very, very Austrian Hammerschmidt clarinet, which is even more Öler than the German Öler, if you see what I mean.
It's Ölerer.
Yes. And he explained to me how he initially began on the Boehm clarinet, as did his father, interestingly, grew up just outside Salzburg. And the reason for that being their teacher, a chappie called Alois Heine, who died in 2005, came over to that area close to Salzburg from France and brought his clarinet with him, and then began teaching. And many of his students have gone on to do great clarinety things, including, of course, Matthias, who's now principal with the Vienna Philharmonic. And Raisa also mentioned, of course, that she was heavily influenced by her teacher, who listened to her sound and advised her on which instrument she might be interested in, and that took off. A third factor, possibly, why it takes off in some places and not others is cost. These instruments are not cheap, and because they're handmade, they're not factory produced. Obviously, that has an effect on how much you're going to have to pay for one, and you're not going to want to buy an instrument that costs a seven-figure sum unless you're absolutely sure that that's the instrument you're going to be playing for the next good many years.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, how much did you say? A seven-figure?
Depending on which currency you're operating in, yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, I was like, wow, we're talking millions of dollars all of a sudden. This is going to be the...
No, I mean, obviously, if you're working in Japanese yen, you're going to have a lot more zeros on the end.
That's true.
Than if you're working in euros or dollars. So,
with the three systems then, the Reform Boehm, would you consider it kind of in the middle between Euler and Boehm, or is it sort of standing on its own?
Well, I think if you were to put them in a line with the Boehm on the one end and the Euler on the other end, yes, I think the Reform Boehm would sit somewhere between them.
So I was expecting when I first tried Reisa's, and for those who don't know what I'm talking about with that, the last episode, a few episodes ago, I interviewed Reisa Falman on the Reform Boehm Clarinet. She went to the Netherlands to study and came back to Canada and had switched while she was there. So if you want to check that out, I think it's episode 11 of the podcast. But I was expecting the fingerings to be a fair bit different for some reason. I thought that it would be crossing them a little bit more, and I was really surprised that they weren't.
Yes, it's principally the same fingering system as the standard Boehm. You do have a couple of extra options and choices. The one which most people rave about is the forked left hand E flat and B flat. I think Raisa mentioned that as well, where you use, on the left hand, you use your thumb, your first finger and your third finger to play an E flat or a B flat, instead of having to use the side key or one of your little top keys.
Yeah, do you still have the option of the little tiny key? Does that still exist? Oh, so you have an extra way.
So you've got another one. You've got an extra option. You've got even more choice, which is why it's so fantastic.
That would be great, actually, for left-hand trills.
If you're playing in what I call flat keys, where you have B flat and A flat, it just makes the transition and scales much smoother.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without having to use the side key, and you're also not hopping with your finger 3 onto the top key. There are no sort of what I would call extras that you have to take into consideration. They're all sort of using the tone holes that are already under your fingers anyway, so that you can achieve a much greater degree of fluency.
So my next question was, I see all these great keywork improvements and things like that, and my thought is, well, why can't you just put these keys onto a normal Boehm? And maybe that's just a mental block I'm having. Like, is the Reform Boehm, it seems like it's beyond the keywork. It's the bore, the realignment of the tone holes, like all these things, correct?
Yes, a Reform Boehm is improved keywork, a slightly different bore and repositioning of the tone holes. You need all three elements to make it a Reform Boehm.
So could we have a slightly reformed Boehm with just the keywork?
You can. If the instrument you're looking for is one that has improved keywork and a standard Boehm bore, then you could go to someone like Wolfgang Dietz and ask them. I think they do one. And I believe there's a place in Japan called Josef. It's a rather odd German spelling for a Japanese manufacturer. I don't know very much about them. But according to their website, they offer an MK11 clarinet, which is a Boehm clarinet that they've added some of the Reform keywork improvements to, but I couldn't find any indication that it has a more German-style bore.
Interesting. So a lot of comments came in about the last episode, and I'm expecting a similar response to this one. I was really surprised by the feedback, actually, because I think most of the other episodes, people either listened or they didn't, or they, like they either wanted to hear what the artist had to say or they didn't want to hear or something. But this one, it seemed like everyone who listened had an opinion, and a lot of people shared that, which I think is fantastic. But I was
great.
Like I said, I was kind of surprised. Some of the comments came in about tuning issues, which is odd because I hear people who play Reform Boehm talk about how the tuning is improved. So what might be causing that discrepancy as far as that goes?
Tuning, yes. With tuning on the Reform Boehm, often the problem lies with the mouthpiece. And if any of your listeners are struggling with tuning issues here, then my first suggestion would be to try some different mouthpieces. Different specifications, German ones, French ones. I had one that I had made by Leitner & Krauss, which is made of wood, and it's absolutely beautiful to look at and produces a wonderful, rich, velvety, voluminous sound. But unfortunately, the lay is about 1.5 millimeters too short, which makes the mouthpiece useless in terms of intonation. So yes, do try some different mouthpieces. Maybe that will solve your intonation problem. I think what people also should remember is that in Germany we play to 4/4/3, and if you have an instrument that's made in Germany, then it will probably be made to 4/4/3 unless you specify that you need it for 4/4/0 or 4/4/2, or you need to make it clear. And I think if people buy an instrument without taking that into consideration, then they're going to go home, sit in their orchestra, and suddenly realize that they're not quite in tune with the rest of the band.
Wow, that's extremely high. I didn't know that. I thought it was 440, 441 or 2 over there.
No, in Hamburg we're on 4/4/3.
Interesting, because I was playing a project last year with marimba, and the marimba is tuned to 442, and all I could do to lip up my clarinet, because I was using a standard length barrel with a 440 tuned mouthpiece, and I was still flat all the time. So I ended up getting a 442 mouthpiece and a millimeter shorter barrel, and that finally fixed it.
I think that's the magic word, the barrel, the mouthpiece as well. Once you start, what I noticed when I switched to Reform is that the old technique of pulling out when you weren't quite in tune, you can pull out on a Reform, but I find the margin that is available to you is much narrower, and very soon you start feeling the resistance coming back because the air column inside the instrument has been compromised by the gap between your barrel and your body joint. Mm-hmm. So what that results in, of course, is a series of barrels for different circumstances. I have a barrel for England, I have barrels for Germany, I have barrels for playing in cold churches, and I have barrels for playing in the desert. So
everywhere.
More or less.
So why would someone consider switching then to this system? What's the market for this type of clarinet?
Well, one of the points I'm trying to make in my PhD is that the ownership of the sound you produce on a clarinet lies with you, the player, or more to a greater degree with you, the player, than with your instrument. You can influence how your sound develops over time, and you can, it will change over time. It's not quite as simple as I'll just pick up a German clarinet and I'll suddenly have a German sound. And several prominent clarinetists claim that they can identify a player regardless of which instrument they're playing on. In Germany, it's a very commonly held belief that you can only produce a German sound on a German instrument, and I'm trying to dispel the idea that it's all in the instrument. So if you are looking for a greater breadth of choice in the sound that you make, or if you're looking for more flexibility in the key work, or if you're looking to, I found with the intonation thing, you don't have to do as much correction with the embouchure as I did on my R13s. You play, you blow, and the intonation sits.
This might be an odd thought that I'm having right now, but I mean, for me, part of playing the clarinet as a musical experience is being involved with what I would call I'm not sure I'd call them imperfections, I'd call them voicing of the notes, you know what I mean? Like, as you go up the scale into the higher clarion range, they're going to go flat unless you do some work with your mouth. But that also kind of clarifies the tone.
I'm not trying to say that there's no work involved.
Oh, okay.
It's not quite that easy. You might as well just play a machine if that were the case.
Yeah.
You still have to produce the sound that comes out of it. It's not like pressing a button and out it comes. You still have to shape it and mold it and form it. But to go back to your question, who is the target audience? I think if you feel that you've reached maybe an impasse with your sound and the possibilities, what you can do with the sound you're producing on your current instrument, then I would certainly suggest it's worth trying.
I think that with the it's so interesting to me because I remember Raisa telling me about this, and it was the clarinets are expensive. I mean, you've got to really be committed. And so how might someone who is considering switching, especially someone in like Canada, go about this responsibly if you can't really find one to try? I mean, it seems like a huge gamble at this point. Are there distributors that sell worldwide and can let you try the instruments, or?
I'm not sure. I mean, certainly in Europe, it's very easy for me because I can just phone them up. They're sort of a couple of hours away on the train. It's no big deal. I really couldn't speak for distributors in Canada, but I would certainly recommend just phoning up the manufacturers and expressing your interest in an instrument and talking to them and see what they suggest.
Yeah, usually these people are pretty reasonable. I mean, they're not going to want you stuck with a 25,000 euro set of clarinets if it's not for you, or
if it's I mean, they obviously if they want to sell you an instrument, they want to sell you an instrument you're going to be happy with and that you're going to love.
So for me, like this might just be because I haven't tried the other systems, but I'm generally happy with my sound and the way that things are. Is it still worth kind of looking into, do you think, just as an exploration, or?
Oh, definitely. As an academic exercise, most definitely. Nobody can tell you have to change. If you're happy with your sound, you're happy with your setup, then if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Don't. What is it called? Don't stop a running system.
Yeah.
But in terms of personal development and experience as a clarinetist, I think you only have to gain by trying it. You can compare it with your own instrument. If you don't like it, that's fine. You've tried it, and you can disregard it. But you have that experience to draw on. You've said, no, it's not for me.
I think that for me thing is so important, and one of the things that I've really gained from talking to people like Martin Frost and Michael Norsworthy on this show here is that I found a running trend is that a lot of these people who are world-class artists and performers, and yourself included, as you talk about this, there's so much focus on you as the person playing the music and what do you want, I think so many people in lessons or education, they go looking to be told what they should be doing to get better. And they need to learn how to decide that for themselves. That's
true. I agree with you, and I think it is a modern thing. I think the move at the moment is taking ownership of the sound you produce as much as the style of phrasing that you deliver, and the colours are also yours to shape and yours to mold and yours to influence.
And this applies to any sort of, I would call it gear. Talk about gear for instruments, like whether it be the instrument itself or the ligature you use. I mean, you should try them all.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, some people use the shoelace, the Schnur, for the mouthpiece.
We should talk about that a little bit, actually. Sorry, what's the history on that? Why do they continue to use that?
I think it's a tradition thing. Some people argue that it gives them a sound that they're happier with. I personally tried it and disliked it. I really didn't like it because I felt it made my sound dull, and it didn't. I just didn't feel I had the resonance in the sound that I wanted. It just felt dull.
There's so much contact, yeah, with the reed.
But again, it's always, it boils down again to the combination of which mouthpiece you're using, which strength reed you have, and it's equation X plus Y plus Z equals nice sound. And you change one of those parameters, then it's obviously going to influence the sound that you produce.
Have you heard of a new company called Vientos Bamboo? They're from Argentina.
No, I haven't.
That's okay. They're doing a string ligature now, or hand-woven ligature or something. It's actually really cool, but it's sort of... I tried it on mine, and it stays on because there's these little sort of shoelace things you can pull and then slide a little tightener into place. But
I think I've seen one, yes.
yeah, it's just surprising that people still choose to tie them by hand versus doing that. It would...
But it's not that difficult.
Yeah, I guess it's like tying your shoes, you know?
It's just like tying a shoelace. And once you have the technique, it's just round and round and round and round and round and sack, and you're finished.
It's done.
It's done. Yeah, and actually, I've seen people do it much more quickly than I can get my my standard Rovna set and fixed and positioned and tightened. You'll be there forever sometimes.
So you are using just a standard ligature on the
I have a Rovna Versa for most of my work, but I do sometimes go back to my Van Doren Optimum, I think it's called.
Mm-hmm. I know that one.
Yeah, depending on how much brightness I want. I find the Optimum a little brighter, and I find the Rovna a little fuller.
Is that the one with those little plates you can switch around, the Van Doren?
Yes, the Van Doren, yes. But the Rovna, I have 2 plates for that as well.
We should talk about the reeds as well. I was curious about that. They're softer and they're smaller. Is that the case?
German reeds are, yes. I use French reeds.
Oh, okay.
Made by an Austrian company called Pilgers. Oh,
So-
I forgot the name. Pilgersdorfer, I believe.
Okay. So you actually can have a little more choice. You must have a different facing then or something than the other German mouthpieces that people use
I have a German Wurlitzer mouthpiece. I believe it must have a French facing because otherwise I wouldn't be able to use French cut reeds.
That's another thing Rayso was mentioning, actually. If you want to, you can continue using the French style
But
mouthpiece and reed.
Yes, but it's not a truly French mouthpiece because it doesn't fit on a buffet.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I don't mean like an actual, that you could take
Yeah.
your French mouthpiece
Yeah.
you currently have, but there's kind of a French facing style or something you can get
Yes, it
for
is.
these.
Yeah, and that's possibly why my experiences when I changed were slightly different from Raisa. She mentioned that her embouchure, she had quite a long time, relatively speaking, to change her style. I didn't find I had that much of a problem. I mean, perhaps I should try a proper, in inverted commas, German mouthpiece as well to just make the experiment and compare the sound. Haven't got round to doing that yet.
So this is an interesting question too. You're from Germany, or you're living in Germany currently, or are you from there originally?
I'm originally from the UK.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to ask how you got playing the Boehm clarinet originally, but so that's how.
That's how. No, I originally started in the UK and I came to Germany when I was in my late 20s, I think.
Okay. Great. So is there anything else you want to share about the Reform Boehm System before we do the last few questions here of the lightning round? Or as Peter Spriggs called it, Vivace round?
Vivace. No, I don't think so. I think
What's your favorite feature about it?
my favorite feature, I don't think it's one particular aspect. I mean, there is the extra trill on it, which means you can trill a G to a G sharp or a C to a C sharp, left hand C to C sharp with your right hand finger 1, which makes it nice easier. But I think my favorite feature is the fact that you have so much more options, so much more choice, both in terms of the sound that you can produce and which fingerings to use.
So thanks so much for coming on the show today, Sue.
Thank you.
Let's do the lightning round now, which is a series of short questions to try and answer in under a minute. But I'm not. No one's on the clock here. It's just, so. But what is one book that you would recommend to the clarinet audience, and why?
One book, I think it would have to be the Jack Brymer one, because even though it's a little bit dated, he does touch on so many fields which were far in advance of what the previous writers on the clarinet had touched upon.
What's the title of that book? Do you remember?
It's called The Clarinet, and it's in the Yehudi Menuhin series.
Yeah, there's that one, and there's some other. I thought he did another book too.
He did do another one. It's called From Where I Sit, and that was his, I believe it's his autobiography. And if anybody would like to buy me that for Christmas, I'd be a very grateful receiver.
Oh, is it out of print?
Possibly. I'm not sure. I haven't got one. That's...
What was the best piece of advice that you ever received, and who gave it to you?
The best piece of advice was given to me by a series of old ladies whom I encountered on the internet, who reflected on their lives as they were nearing the end of theirs, and they said, follow your dream, because the regret you feel when you're old and didn't follow your dream is much, much greater than the effort it would take to actually do what you want to do while you still can.
Wow, that's deep. How did you encounter these? What was these women?
To be honest, I think it was just sort of some banal Facebook better yourself post something video, nothing of any great seriousness that I just clicked on one day while I was procrastinating.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very true though.
Yes, I think it is true.
If I were to walk over to your music stand right now, what would I find?
Well, I've got 3 big concerts coming up this weekend. So you'd find Gershwin's piano concerto for the bass clarinet, Raval's La Valse for the bass clarinet, plus some chamber music I'm working on, the Butkovitz 4 bagatelles, some Kopsch studies, which are always on my music stand. And then you'd also find some essentials, which I have there for the bass clarinet, including Bach cello suites, and a piece by Mark Mellitz called Black that I play every now and again with my bass clarinet duo.
Is your bass clarinet Reform Boehm as well?
No, it's not. I did try the Reform Boehm bass clarinet at Leitner and Krauss, and they made it especially for me to try. And I decided in the end not to buy it because it was hugely expensive, and I didn't really feel comfortable with the non-automatic register key stroke B flat thing. There's two speaker keys for the upper octave.
Oh, so you have to kind of choose which one you're using?
Yes, on the bass clarinet, and on most bass clarinets it's an automatic mechanism. But the one they produced then, whenever it was, a few years ago, it wasn't yet with the automatic mechanism. And it was too much money to have to relearn something so fundamental. I believe they have now made one that has the automatic mechanism. I'm not 100% sure, but if anybody is interested in one, I know they would make one. They do that for people. But I've since got a Selmer Privilege, I believe it's called. I always get it mixed up with the... I always mix it up with Prestige. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, there's 2 models or something they have.
There's a Prestige, which is the Buffet R13 Prestige model. And
Selmer is the Privilege, yeah.
Selmer's the Privilege, yeah. So I have a Selmer Privilege.
Interesting. What is and people hate this question so far, but it's a good one. That's why I keep it in here. What is your all-time favorite piece of music?
It's not possible to have an all-time favorite piece of music because moods change, weather changes, everything changes. But if I were cast away on a desert island and could only take one record with me, then it would be Mahler's Second Symphony. In addition to the Mahler Second Symphony, because, Mahler's Second Symphony contains every possible human emotion ever. But I also couldn't live without Bach, of course, without the Big Father, and also without Schubert's Winterreise for those darker moments. Schubert Winterreise is actually the piece of music that brought me to Germany and made me learn German.
Really?
And there's also a pretty random piece which was played by a group called the Rogues of Scotland, which is a Scottish or an American Scottish pipes and drums band, and it's called the Gravel Walk, and it morphs halfway through into Andy Rennick's Regret, and then morphs back again, and that is just euphoria. Poor. You put that on full volume and dance around the living room when nobody's watching, and that is fantastic.
So I have a feeling I know the next answer to this question based on your piece, your favorite piece. But if you could go back in time, or even in the present, if you could meet any musician, past or present, who would it be and why?
There would have to be two. I'd have to meet Bach to introduce him to the clarinet.
Oh.
But I would also have to go back in time and meet Mahler and his wife. He wrote her an awful letter, either on the eve of their wedding or just after, saying, it would be embarrassing. I couldn't possibly bear the shame of having a wife who was a better composer than I am, so stop. Or words to that effect. To his credit, I must add that he did actually realize the error of his ways towards the end of his life, and sort of, as the Germans would say, buried his head in ashes.
Interesting.
And asked for forgiveness. But yes, that is one of the greatest losses to the classical music world, that Mahler forbade his wife to compose.
That's terrible. I had no idea about that. So if people are interested in learning more about you or the Reform Boehm system, how can they find you online?
Well, I do have a website, which is www.sueryall.com. I'm afraid I don't speak hashtag, but I am on Facebook. You can find me with a picture of me and my clarinet. And yes, I'd be very happy to hear from anybody who's got something to say about the Reform Boehm, or about the sound differences, or alleged sound differences, if you like, between the three clarinets that we've talked about today.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is redefining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with technology built from the ground up. By using the world's most innovative techniques to deliver consistently what was once made variable by hand, D'Addario ensures excellence right out of the box as standard, not a surprise. So you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds.